Richard Foster from Foster Infrastructure here. Many governments face challenges in delivering the full range of infrastructure required or desirable for their communities. What's the role that project financing can play in helping governments to meet these infrastructure needs? Well, to look at that, we need to think first about two key issues in terms of the money required for these large and costly infrastructure projects. The first thing we need to think about is where is the money going to come from in the short term to meet the construction costs? This is what we call financing. Financing, assuming that the government does not just have the money sitting around in a bank account, financing can come from government borrowings. The government can borrow the money to meet the cost of construction, or the government can ask the private sector to raise the finance, and the private sector can raise the finance to meet the cost of construction of infrastructure. So that solves a short-term problem of where do we find the money from in the short term to meet the construction costs. In the longer term, however, we have to ultimately repay that finance and also meet the ongoing operating and maintenance costs of the infrastructure. And that's where we come to funding. From a government perspective, funding is the money that will be used in the long term to repay the finance and to meet ongoing operating and maintenance costs. Funding typically comes from taxes or from user charges charged to the users of the infrastructure, although there are various other mechanisms for raising funding for projects. So if we have choices in terms of our financing, government financing or private sector financing, and choices in terms of our funding, either taxes or user charges, we can combine those in different ways, and that is illustrated by this diagram here. In this diagram, we have our choices of financing options on the horizontal axis, so government borrowing on the left, private sector finance on the right, and we have our choice of funding options on the vertical axis. So we have user charges at the top and the government budget using money raised through the tax system at the bottom. So we can combine our funding and financing in essentially four basic ways, starting from the bottom left-hand corner, what we call traditional government infrastructure delivery, or budget sector delivery, or conventional delivery. This is where the government raises the money to meet the construction costs, typically through borrowing, and then once the project is operational, the government uses tax revenue to repay the borrowings and meet the operating and maintenance costs. Rather than using tax revenue to repay the borrowing and meet the operating and maintenance costs, the government instead could borrow the money to build the project and then charge the users for the use of the infrastructure and use that revenue from the users in order to repay the borrowings and meet the ongoing operations and maintenance costs. That is in the top left corner, and that is what we would typically see where government infrastructure is developed by a government business enterprise or a state-owned enterprise, which levies charges to the users of the infrastructure. We don't have to leave the financing up to the government though. We could instead take our project with user charges, which might be a road project, and rather than having government borrow the money to meet the construction costs, we could ask the private sector to raise the finance, meet the construction costs, build the infrastructure, and then collect the charges from the users and use those charges from the users to repay that private sector finance and meet the ongoing operation and maintenance costs. And that is one of our classic forms of public-private partnership, or PPP. It's a toll road provided by the private sector under a PPP contract. What about if we have a project though where we don't want to charge the users? Well, we can still ask the private sector to raise the finance, build the infrastructure, and then be responsible for its operations and maintenance over a period of time. But in this case, rather than charging the users, what we do is we have the government collect tax revenue and use that tax revenue to make payments over the operational period of a public-private partnership. And those payments from government to the private partner are used by the private partner to repay the finance and meet the operating and maintenance costs. So that's what we typically call an availability PPP, because government pays for the availability of the infrastructure. So there are four basic forms in which financing and funding can be combined for the delivery of major infrastructure projects of the government. These are the four simplest approaches. Typically, the two approaches on the right-hand side, the public-private partnerships, where we have the private sector providing the finance, that finance is most commonly in the form of project finance. Project finance being limited recourse finance raised for the project, typically through a special purpose corporate vehicle that is a company solely devoted to this one particular project. We could, however, also use project finance techniques for a project undertaken by a government business enterprise or state-owned enterprise. That is less common, but certainly there are examples around the world of project finance techniques being used where it is actually a government body that is undertaking the project and raising the finance. That's my quick overview of the concepts of financing and funding in the context of major government infrastructure projects, and that gives us a quick understanding of what the scope is for governments to leverage private finance, project finance techniques through public-private partnerships to create different forms of infrastructure delivery.